everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us the remaining parts of concept number 4. Remember, concept number 4 is all about cell respiration. So in this video, we're actually going to continue to talk about cell respiration, but now we're going to talk about another type of respiration called fermentation. Here, we'll talk about how fermentation is a process that actually does not require oxygen. Now, because no oxygen is required, this process is anaerobic. Now, the anaerobic pathways are not very efficient, and so the energy transferred from glucose to ATP is not as much as it would be if it were aerobic respiration, which is the type of respiration we have been talking about. Now, about how many ATP actually get made through fermentation, that would really only be about 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose, compared to aerobic respiration, which we know can range between 36 to almost 38 ATP being made per glucose molecule. Now, there's two main types of fermentation that we need to know, and one of them is called alcoholic fermentation, while the other you might be familiar with already, and that's called lactic acid fermentation. Now, alcoholic fermentation is when organisms like yeast perform alcoholic fermentation. So, yeast still go through glycolysis. That step does not change. And we know that in glycolysis, glucose gets broken down into pyruvic acid. So here in alcoholic fermentation, yeast are then going to take that pyruvic acid and turn it into ethyl alcohol whenever they run out of oxygen. And so that's why we tend to use yeast in the process of making any type of alcoholic drink. We can actually also use them in the process of making bread. Now, what are the steps involved in alcoholic fermentation? Well, remember, we always start with glucose, and we know that that gets broken down in the process of glycolysis, which we know takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. As a result, that pyruvic acid gets further broken down into ethyl alcohol in alcoholic fermentation. And from there, carbon dioxide will be released. Now, yeast use this process both in making alcoholic drinks as well as in the baking industry. The alcohol that gets made makes alcoholic beverages, but the carbon dioxide that gets given off is actually what causes your bread dough to rise. Now, those small bubbles that form in the dough, making that bread rise, actually eventually will evaporate. So all the alcohol that gets produced from alcoholic fermentation evaporates during the baking process. So that's why you do not consume any alcohol when you consume bread. Now, another type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. This is the type of fermentation that animal cells will perform, plant cells, and even some bacteria perform lactic acid fermentation. Similar to alcoholic fermentation and aerobic respiration, glycolysis always comes first. We see here glucose gets broken down, turned into pyruvic acid, and then from there, when no oxygen is available, that pyruvic acid gets then changed into lactic acid. So our pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid by our muscle cells when we know that there is an oxygen debt. It's produced in our muscles during some sort of strenuous exercise because now our muscles are using up all of the oxygen that might be present, and our body is not being able to supply those muscles with enough oxygen to then keep up with the activity that we are performing. But remember, our muscles don't consistently stay in lactic acid fermentation. After you perform that strenuous exercise and you rest, right, your heart level goes back down, your muscles then get plentiful enough oxygen, That lactic acid gets changed back into pyruvic acid and then enters into the mitochondria for then the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to take place. Now, the lactic acid that does build up in your muscles tends to cause severe cramps. And that's actually because it lowers the pH of your muscle and reduces its ability to contract. When oxygen then returns, we know that lactic acid gets converted back to pyruvic acid, and aerobic respiration will happen all over again. Now, when lactic acid happens in bacteria, we can actually use those effects to make a lot of the foods that we know of today. So, things like cheeses, yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, pickles, or even sauerkraut are all made due to lactic acid fermentation in bacteria. All right, guys, that is it for our concept number 4. In class tomorrow, I will give some time to work on the questions and summary and complete our aerobic anaerobic lab.